Hello and welcome back to computer programming. All right, so today's topic is nested loops, which is basically a fancy way of saying when you put a loop inside of another loop, right? So you've got the activity inside of Google Classroom. It's called nested loops. All right, we're going to do what we always do. We're going to click on the zip file. It's going to tell us we couldn't preview it. We're going to click on the dots and go to open a new window. All right, now we're going to be able to download it. All right, it's going to download it to our computer. So we open the Windows or the File Explorer. We go to our downloads. There it is in its zipped version. So now we have to unzip it. So we're going to right click on the zippered file. We're going to choose Extract All. We're going to click Extract. All right, it opens it up in a new window, but I'm going to close that first. I'm going to delete the zipped version because I don't need it anymore. And I'm going to drag the unzipped version into my computer programming folder so that I have everything nice and neat and organized. And there it is down there with all the other loop labs. All right, so if I open this up and I open the file, let's see what it actually has inside. All right, so what are we looking at here? All right, we've got our standard include statements. We've got our using namespace standard. We've got int main. And then you're just basically seeing a whole bunch of loops and a whole bunch of print statements. All right, so let's run it first so that you can see what happens, and then we'll explain why that's happening. All right. All right, so on this first one, we're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then we're going down a line and we're seeing it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And then on the second one, we're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then 9, 8, 7, 5, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then that's just repeating over and over and over again. All right, so let's take a look now at the code that's actually causing this stuff to be generated. All right, so I have I and j, which are just my loop variables. All right, that's what I'm using this program as my loop variables. And then I have this first loop statement that says for I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. And then I have the second one that says for j equals 1, j less than or equal to 10, j plus plus. And then inside of this, I'm counting j. And then after this loop is over, I'm hitting basically the enter key by counting end L. All right. So what happens when you put a loop inside of a loop? All right, so what we learned previously is that when you have a loop, we start by initializing our loop variable. Then we check the condition. If the condition is true, we then enter the loop and execute the code inside of the loop. All right, so what happens when you have a loop inside of a loop is effectively that every time this loop runs once, this loop is going to run all 10 times. So for example, all right, this starts off I equals 0. All right, so when I equals 0, j is going to go through its entire loop. So j is going to be 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7, and then 8, and then 9, and then 10, and then it'll eventually go to 11 because remember, the increment happens, which makes this no longer true, and we skip over the loop. So technically it's at 11, but it runs 10 times. And then this loop will finish. I will go to 1, so I will become 1. It'll go up 1, and then j will go through that whole process again and again and again and again, and so on and so forth. So every time the outer loop runs once, the inner loop has to run to completion. All right, so if we think about this, this loop is running 10 times because it goes from 1 to less than or equal to 10. This loop is also running 10 times because it goes from 0 to less than 10. So this one little cout statement is actually going to happen 100 times. All right, it's going to happen 10 times each time this loop runs. And this loop, this entire loop gets executed 10 times because it's inside of this outer loop that is also running 10 times. So 10 times 10, that's where the 100 times are. All right, if I were to put another loop inside of here, let's get really crazy. For int k equals, 1, k less than or equal to 10, k plus plus. Right, that little cout statement would now actually be happening 1,000 times. All right, 10 times 10 times 10. All right, because each time this loop runs, this one has to run 10 times, and each time this one runs, this one also runs 10 times. So 10 times 10, 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000. All right, so we can get things to happen over and over and over again if we put loops inside of loops inside of loops inside of loops. All right, so that's the general idea. All right, a nested loop is when you put a loop inside of a loop, and effectively the behavior is that the inner loop has to run to completion every time the outer loop runs once. All right, so what we're seeing here is we have our outer loop. All right, that's controlling how many lines we're getting. So the reason we get 10 lines is because this outer loop is set to 10. And then the inner loop is actually with printing out the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Each time through this loop, we're just printing out a single number. We don't drop to a new line until this inner loop is finished. And then we circle back up and the process repeats. So if I were to change this to 5, all right, my count would still go from 1 to 10, but now I would only get 5 rows. All right, the outer loop is controlling how many rows I get. The inner loop is controlling how high it counts up. Now, the placement of this cout is important. All right, if I were to put this inside this inner loop, then I'd be hitting enter after each number, and that's going to look totally different. All right, so you kind of have to think about how the loops fit together and how that's going to affect what actually is printing out or ending up on the screen. So if I put the cout inside of the inner loop, then after each number, I'm hitting enter, and I lose that sort of block structure that I had before. All right, so you got to kind of think about where you're putting things when you have these nested loops. Do you need it to repeat every single time? Do you only want it to happen after one of the loops is finished? But by placing things in different locations, it can get us different results. So again, this outer loop is affecting how many rows we get, and then this inner loop is affecting sort of what we count up to. So if I change this to 20, then all of a sudden I'd be counting up to 20 each time. All right, so if I rerun this now, I'm still going to have the 5 rows because I left my outer loop at 5, but now it's counting all the way up to 20. So again, the two different loops are controlling different aspects of what's coming out on the screen, and by tinkering with those and modifying them up and down, you can change the result that you're getting. All right. Now the second example is very similar. It's just showing you that you could have multiple loops inside of your outer loop here. All right, so notice that these two for loops are not inside of each other, but they're both inside of this for loop. All right, so what's going to happen is I is going to be 0. This loop is going to run to completion, printing out numbers. Then the second loop is going to start. It's also going to run to completion, printing out numbers. And then we're going to loop back up top. I will go to 1, and the whole process will continue to repeat again and again and again. All right, so when we look at the output on this one, all right, the outer loop is controlling the fact that I'm getting 10 of these. The first loop is the one that's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then the second loop is the one that's going 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so again, if I change the outer loop, that's going to change how many rows I'm getting. So like if I do that, I only get 3 rows. If I change either of these loops, that's going to change the numbers that I'm going up or down to. So if I change this to like 15 and then started this one at 14, now I'm counting up to 15 and counting down for 14 and lower. All right, so if we look at that, you'll see that we get a slightly different output this time. We're only getting the 3 rows, but they're going all the way up to 15, and then they're going back down to 1. And I got these by kind of modifying some different stuff here. All right, so this nested loop structure is going to become really important in our next unit when we start working with arrays. So what you're going to be doing is you're just going to be playing around with these nested loops, and you're going to be trying to create different shapes. All right, so what do I mean by that? All right, if we flip over to the actual Google Doc, all right, what we have here, let's click on it, is a bunch of shapes that you're going to be trying to create using nested loops. All right, so you're going to be doing different things inside of these loops to create these different shapes. All right, so the first one is very simply just, printing 10 stars across and having that happen 4 times. All right, the next one is you've got 5 rows, and each time you're printing out 1 extra star. And then this one, you're kind of flipping it around and getting a different shape. This one, you're getting like a Christmas tree shape. And then in these two, you're sort of trading out the stars for numbers. All right, so that's the goal of this lab, is to use nested loops to create these 6 different shapes. And actually, technically, you only need to create 5. Question 6 is a bonus and not necessary to receive credit. All right, so 6 is there as a challenge, but you don't have to get 6 working to be able to turn in this lab and get full credit. Now on the bottom here, it gives you various hints. So like for exercise 1, it says count the number of rows. That's how long your outer loop needs to run. Count the number of stars. That's how long your inner loop needs to run. All right, so it kind of gives you a starting point to sort of figure things out. Exercise 2, create a variable that keeps track of the number of stars needed per line. So example, that variable might start off at 1. And then each time through the outer loop, that variable needs to get 1 bigger. All right, so it'll be 1 the first time, then it'll be 2 the second time, 3 the third time, 4 the 4th time. And you can use this variable as part of your inner loop to figure out how many stars are going to get printed out. All right, number 3 is where you're going to start using 2 loops. All right, so that's going to be kind of like this structure that I showed in example 2. All right, the first loop is going to be to print out spaces. All right, and to print out a space, you would just put quotes, hit the space bar, and then close your quotes. That would print out like a single space. And then you're going to have a second loop that actually prints out the stars. All right, and similarly, you can have like a variable that keeps track of how many spaces you need, and that needs to get a little smaller. You can have a variable that keeps track of the stars you need, and that gets a little bigger as you go. All right, but you're trying to create these different shapes. Right? When you get to these last couple, one thing I want to point out, because sometimes kids get a little confused on this, is you don't actually need a loop to print out the spaces on the right-hand side. It's just going to look like they're there. So if you print out the spaces on the left-hand side and print out the stars, there's no need to write code to actually print out spaces on the right-hand side. It'll just look like there's space there on the screen. We won't actually know whether you hit the space bar or not. And we'd have no idea if your spaces were correct or not because we don't actually visually see them. All right, so when you're doing these bottom ones, you're still only going to need 2 loops, 1 for the spaces, 1 for the stars, 1 for the spaces, 1 for the numbers. Okay, this is the only one where you might use 3 loops. You might have 1 for the spaces, a loop that's counting down, and then a loop that's counting up. But again, there's multiple ways to do that last one. So I'm not going to steer you in one direction or another. All right, so that's the activity, is trying to create these different shapes inside of your program. Now, I'm going to show you kind of how to just get the first one sort of going, and then you'll have to pick up from there. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out all of this stuff just so that we can keep it as an example, but we don't actually need to be using it anymore. So I've got my /* and I'm putting it right above in front of my first variable there. And then down here, I'm going to do my * / to end the comment. So now I've got all of those up above, but they're not actually running and kind of interfering. So I'm going to create 2 variables because each one of these is going to have at least 2 loops. All right. You can use I and j, or you can use something more descriptive. So I could be like, okay, int outer. I'm going to use this one for my outer loop. And I could say int inner, and I'm going to use this one for my inner loop. All right, it's up to you. But the general structure for all of these is you're going to have a loop. Okay. And then inside of that loop, you're going to have a second loop. Now, again, for that first one, all right, you're trying to get, whoops, not where I wanted to go. You're trying to get 4 rows. So that means your outer loop is going to have to run 4 times. All right, so I'm not going to set that up for you, but I will put a comment in here. Should run 4 times. And then I'm just going to put semicolons in here right now because otherwise it'll give me an error when I try to compile it. And then if we look at this sheet, this is saying there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 stars. So this one should run 10 times. Now, as far as what's actually going inside this one, all you're doing in a single loop is printing out 1 star, all right? It's the loop that's going to make it so that 10 of them show up, all right? So you shouldn't just be typing in 10 asterisks here. We're typing in 1 star and then having the loop run 10 times. And again, I'm putting the semicolons in there just so it'll compile right now. And then at the end of each line, we want to go down to a new line. So I'm not going to put my end-L inside of here. I'm going to wait till that inner loop is finished. I'm going to wait until all 10 stars have been printed out. And then I'm going to go down to a new line so that I get the shape that I'm looking for on this very first one. All right, so that's kind of the jump start that I'm giving you. As you work through them, you can just put them one after another. So after you finish the first one, what I would do is I would just put in a couple end-Ls so that you've got some space, and then you can start exercise 2 right after that. All right, so you're setting up your loops, you're setting up any variables you need, and you're going from there. All right, you're welcome to continue using outer and inner, but if you do, don't forget to like reset them. So like, you know, they're going to have whatever values they have in them after these loops finish. So when you're starting the new one, actually you can just reset them in the loop. All right, I guess you don't really have to reset them here. You can just reset them in your loop when you're saying like 4 inner equals 0 or something like that. So that's fine. But there are other variables when you start getting into the number of stars and the number of spaces that you might want to reset depending on kind of how you do them. All right, that's kind of actually what I was thinking of when I talked about that there. All right, so again, I'll leave it up to you. All right, I don't want to, you know, give away too much on these. I think they're kind of fun to try to figure out and puzzle your way through, and they're very visual. Like, try something, see what happens, and then go from there. Be like, oh, okay, it's doing this, but I needed to do that. So what do I have to change? What's working? What's not working? But you sort of get that visual feedback every time you run it, and that should kind of help you figure these out. All right. So again, I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, just let me know, and we'll go from there. All right. Have a great day.